You've just enlisted in the Roman legions, or rather, you've been voluntold. Maybe you were desperate, maybe you were poor, maybe you annoyed the wrong centurion and woke up shackled with a shaved head and a wooden sword. Either way, your life now belongs to Rome officially for the next 25 years. That's not a typo. 25 years. That's your new sentence. Sign up at 17, and if you're lucky, really lucky, you'll still have some working joints and most of your original organs by the time you're 42. Retirement comes with a tiny plot of land, a handshake, and a lingering case of PTSD. Your first stop, training. If you thought gym class was traumatic, you're about to experience push-ups Roman style. They don't just train your body, they break your soul and stitch it back together with pigskin and vinegar. You'll march for 20 miles a day in armor, carrying roughly 90 tons of gear. That's the weight of a small llama on your back, every single day. Rain or shine, especially rain. Your instructors are not friendly. Their primary job is to scream at you until your ancestors feel it. If you slip in formation, you're beaten. If you pass out, beaten. If you question why any of this matters, you guessed it, beaten. By week 2, you've forgotten what comfort feels like. Your feet are bleeding, your shoulders are permanently indented from the pack straps, and you've started to view unconsciousness as a valid vacation plan. You're not a person anymore, you're a cog, a marching, sweating, occasionally sobbing cog in the vast Roman war machine. And that's exactly how they like it. Let's talk equipment, because nothing says imperial might like strapping yourself into 70 paltals of poorly ventilated iron and pretending it's comfortable. You wear a lorica segmentata, a segmented metal cuirass, which is Latin for "this will chafe your nipples off." It's rigid, inflexible, and pinches your skin every time you move your arms even slightly. The helmet has cheek guards that make you sound like a drunk, marionette, and a neck flap that's supposed to protect you but mostly traps your sweat until it becomes a sentient entity. Your sandals, caligae, are heavy-soled, open-toed leather shoes. They look like gladiator footwear on Instagram. In reality, blister factories. After 1 week, your feet resemble boiled potatoes that someone stepped on. And don't forget your gladius, your short, stabbing sword. It's practical, yes, but also about as balanced as an iron spoon. You'll learn to stab, not slice. Slicing is for barbarians. Romans stab again and again and again until your forearm seizes up or your opponent stops moving, whichever comes first. Oh, and you're responsible for all your own gear. Lose your helmet, you pay for it, and break your sword? Guess who's on latrine duty for the next month? Hint, it's you. You also carry a pilum, a long bendy javelin that's great for throwing once and then immediately useless, which is fun because you'll spend a lot of time sharpening more. All in all, your gear is an elaborate collection of discomfort, weight, and obligation. You wear it, haul it, clean it, and try not to drown in your own sweat while doing so. Now that you've been broken down into a semi-obedient meat machine, it's time for the fun part. Marching, that's what most of a Roman soldier's life is. Marching. Not fighting, not glory, just endless soul-eroding trudging. 20 miles a day, sometimes 30, sometimes more if your commander is feeling spicy. You carry your tent, your armor, your weapons, your food, your tools, and possibly your hopes and dreams, though those are usually the first to go. The terrain, mountains, swamps, forests, deserts. You'll march through them all. Sand in your sandals, bugs in your beard, mud up to your thighs. And at the end of every grueling day, you don't rest. Oh no. You build a camp from scratch with a ditch and a wall every single night. Why? Because Rome fears ambushes and comfort. You sleep on the ground in a tiny tent shared with 7 other sweaty men, surrounded by the noises of wild animals and other humans trying to remember what joy once felt like. Your body is broken, your feet are swollen, and the soles of your sandals are held together with wishful thinking and goat sinew. But still, you march. And the worst part, no one applauds. There's no medal for most blistered, just another dawn, another order, and another 20 miles waiting for you. This is your life now, not a warrior, a walker, a sweating, trudging, blistered walker, forever forward until you drop. Eventually, after months of marching and digging and being yelled at, you actually reach a battlefield. Hooray, it's the worst day of your life. You line up shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, in a tightly packed formation. Your armor is soaked with sweat, your mouth is dry, and your bowels are negotiating an escape plan. The centurion yells something incomprehensible. You raise your shield. The enemy charges. Battle is not clean. It's not noble. It's not poetic. It's screaming, stabbing, slipping on blood, and trying not to trip over the severed hand of the guy who was just talking to you. Your sword thrusts forward again and again. You don't think, you react. You try not to cry, but the smell, gods, and the smell is a mix of iron, bile, human waste, and burning hair. It clings to your nostrils and moves in with no intention of ever leaving. If you're lucky, the battle ends in a few hours. If not, you fight until your muscles cramp and your ears ring with the howls of dying men. And if you live, there's no therapy, just a half-rotted ration and a night of pretending you don't hear your comrade weeping quietly in his sleep. Victory doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like exhaustion, soaked in blood. The only celebration is that you didn't die. Yet. And tomorrow there's another battle, or a march, or an ambush. There's always more and never less, so you survived. Congratulations, that puts you ahead of a significant portion of your unit. Your reward, looting. Sounds fun, right? Ransacking a city, pillaging goods, taking what you can carry. But here's the thing, most of the loot goes to your commanders. You get scraps. Maybe a rusty dagger, a chipped bracelet, or a goat that now hates you personally. There's also the matter of what you're expected to do in a sacked city. The Roman army has policies, let's say, policies that involve terrifying civilians, setting things on fire, and other actions that would earn you a lengthy prison sentence today. Back then it was called a Tuesday. But don't get too excited about that goat. You have to carry it back on the march home. That's right, you steal it, you schlep it. The locals don't exactly throw you parades. They hide their daughters, their valuables, and their knives. You're not a hero. You're an occupying force with lice and halitosis. Whatever trinkets you collect may end up stolen from you anyway by your fellow soldiers. Trust is rare. Theft is common. Justice is theoretical. And remember, if you take too much or offend the wrong officer, you're flogged, demoted, or executed. The line between loot and crime is written in disappearing ink. So enjoy your spoils, assuming you survive long enough to spend them. You're probably hungry after all that, right? Great, because the Roman army runs on a strict diet of mediocrity. Barley porridge, sometimes with onions, occasionally with dried meat that tastes like regret, and contains enough salt to mummify a medium-sized ox. Rations are carefully portioned and often rancid. There's no hot lunch, just a communal pot and some vague prayers to Fortuna that it won't give you dysentery. You eat with your hands or whatever instrument hasn't rusted yet. You eat fast or not at all. And don't even dream of wine. That's for officers. You get posca, a sour vinegar-water mix that doubles as mouthwash, antiseptic, and the final straw for your dignity. Bon appetit. Bread is a staple, but it's rock hard. You use your dagger to carve pieces off, like you're whittling driftwood. Sometimes it has bugs. No one cares. Vegetables are seasonal and optional, mostly optional. Meat is rare and suspicious. That stew might be rabbit, might also be rat, hard to say. You eat to survive, not to enjoy, and you eat surrounded by other men loudly chewing and scratching themselves. It's a symphony of gastrointestinal indifference, but don't complain. Complaining means punishment, and nobody wants to clean the latrines again. Ah yes, hygiene. A modern luxury you used to take for granted. Showers, soap, deodorant, all gone. Welcome to the Roman approach to cleanliness, which is, in theory, quite advanced. In theory, public baths exist, big marble buildings with heated rooms, pools of various temperatures, and occasionally someone getting stabbed in the tepidarium over a dice game. But here's the catch, they're public, which means you're bathing shoulder to shoulder with 80 other sweaty men who haven't heard the word privacy since birth. Also, those baths, they're not free. You need to pay with coin or favors. And after a long campaign, you might be too broke to afford a scrub. So, you rinse off in rivers, ponds, or not at all. The term smelling like victory now means smelling slightly less like moldy beef jerky. Soap isn't exactly a household staple. If you're lucky, you get a lump of animal fat mixed with ash. If you're unlucky, you get a rough cloth, a prayer, and a wish that the lice will drown in your sweat before they multiply again. And about those lice, they are your constant companions. They live in your hair, your tunic, your bedding. You might burn your uniform just to evict them, but then you're naked and still infested. It's a lose-lose. Athletes' foot ringworm and scabies are regular visitors. No creams, no powders, just open wounds and herbal poultices applied by a guy who thinks mold is magical. You go to sleep scratching and wake up bleeding. So yes, Rome may have invented aqueducts, but when it comes to your personal hygiene, you are still a walking biohazard with a sword. The cologne of the common legionary is equal parts smoke, sweat, mildew, and existential dread. So you've been stabbed, clubbed, trampled, or you sneezed in a weird way, and now half your unit thinks you've got the plague. Time to visit the medicus. The Roman army's answer to how much pain can you endure before passing out in a ditch? Let's be clear, Roman military medicine wasn't all leeches and prayers. It was often worse. Field hospitals called valetudinaria existed, sure, but imagine a hut built from leftover siege wood, filled with groaning men, open wounds, and one guy in the corner softly whispering to his detached thumb. Welcome to healthcare, ancient Rome style. Your medicus is not a trained doctor. He's a guy who's seen a lot of wounds and owns a collection of rusty tools that resemble gardening implements. His qualifications: he survived a fever once and has a strong stomach. That's about it. Sanitation, adorable concept. Surgical tools are reused, bandages are reused, hands are reused, often without washing. If you're lucky, your wound gets rinsed with wine or vinegar. If not, well, hopefully the ants crawling across your leg aren't carnivorous. Pain relief? There's no morphine, no anesthesia. There's opium, if someone's rich enough, but mostly it's bite down on a stick and hope you don't scream loud enough to attract carrion birds. Some soldiers preferred dying in battle because at least that was quicker and didn't involve someone rooting around in their insides with a bronze scalpel. Broken bones, they get splintered with wood and hope. Infections, you're bled, purged, or given herbs that may or may not be poison. Missing limb? No prosthetics, just a new nickname and a strong limp. Mental trauma, that's called weakness. Stop whining and go stab someone. And if you catch anything contagious like dysentery, malaria, or whatever mystery disease is currently chewing through the camp, you're either quarantined in a tent that smells like sadness or quietly encouraged to die behind the latrines so your screaming doesn't upset morale. Sometimes they drill holes in your skull to release pressure. Sometimes they rub mashed garlic into open wounds. Sometimes they simply stare at you, sigh and say, perhaps Mars will have mercy. So yes, the Romans conquered the known world. But when it came to healing their soldiers, their motto might as well have been, well, he made it through breakfast, that's a win. In the Roman army, religion isn't a private matter. It's state-sponsored anxiety. You don't just believe, you participate, publicly, frequently, and often while holding a dead animal. Let's start with the basics. The Roman gods are many, moody, and not particularly invested in your personal survival. Jupiter wants loyalty, Mars wants blood. Mercury wants you to shut up and march faster. There's a god for war, for harvest, for doors, for hinges, and for sneezing on a Tuesday. The pantheon is crowded, and none of them are known for being gentle. Before any major action, a battle, a campaign, a really ambitious latrine-digging project, there are sacrifices, actual sacrifices. A pig, a bull, maybe a sheep if the budget's tight. A priest slaughters the poor thing, slices open its guts and pokes around in the liver to read omens. If the liver looks healthy, hooray, your odds of not dying just improved by one imaginary percentage point. You're expected to show up, watch this bloody fortune-telling session, and nod respectfully even as the smell of burning entrails wafts into your nostrils. Miss a ritual, the gods might get angry. Complain too loudly, the centurion might get angrier. Each legion has its own standards, physical ones and spiritual ones. These are sacred symbols carried into battle, guarded fiercely, and used to rally troops mid-slaughter. Lose your standard and the entire unit is shamed. You might be flogged, demoted, or used as a cautionary tale for the next 100 years. Your camp has altars, tiny shrines where you leave offerings, bread, wine, incense, or whatever's left of your will to live. You kneel, you pray, and you ask Mars or Mithras or whoever's on shift to maybe, just maybe, not let your intestines spill out tomorrow morning. And then there are the mystery cults. Soldiers love those, especially Mithraism, a god of contracts and courage, popular with the military. Joining involves initiation rites, so secret and weird. You're not sure if it's religion or an early version of fraternity hazing involving blindfolds and animal blood. The Roman military also has a problem with foreign gods. March into Egypt, Gaul, or Britannia, and suddenly you're surrounded by strange altars and stranger rituals. Some soldiers join in, some don't. Either way, the legion doesn't care what god you whisper to at night, so long as you're still up at dawn, stabbing things in the name of Rome. Ultimately, religion in the Roman army is not about comfort. It's not about peace. It's about order, ritual, discipline, appeasing higher powers so your commanders can feel righteous while throwing you into another hopeless siege. And deep down in your lice-bitten soul, you start praying too. Not because you believe it will change anything, but because when your world is this uncertain, even the illusion of control feels holy. So your units being shipped out. Gaul, Britannia, Dacia, somewhere with vowels missing and tribes that hate you. You don't know why, you don't care, you just know the march will take months, the locals will throw javelins at you, and the weather will try to kill you in creative ways. Let's talk Britannia. It's wet, always wet, the sky drips, the rivers overflow, the mud has its own zip code, the locals paint themselves blue, scream at the moon and ambush you with sharpened sticks. You don't understand their language and they don't want to understand yours. In Dacia, it's mountains and forests. Beautiful in a you'll be buried here kind of way. Wolves howl at night, bandits slit throats in the morning. Your armor rusts from the humidity. Your morale rusts from everything else. Gaul? Slightly better wine, slightly worse beheadings. The tribes are organized, which makes them more terrifying. They fight dirty, and they don't care about your fancy Roman discipline. They fight to live. You fight because you're paid in stale biscuits. The worst part isn't the battles, it's the boredom in between. Long days of nothing but guard duty, camp construction, and wondering which parasite is making your stomach gurgle this time. You read the same scratched graffiti on your shield just to feel something, and when you do get home, assuming you do, the locals don't throw parades. They glare. They spit. You're the face of conquest, the symbol of oppression. You left as a hopeful recruit. You return as an imperial enforcer with trench foot. So yes, travel broadens the mind, and occasionally slices it open with a Celtic axe. Being a Roman soldier means living under a system of discipline so strict it would make modern prison wardens blink twice. Rome doesn't do leniency, Rome does examples. You mess up, you're not getting a warning. You're getting flogged, fined, or fed to a punishment detail like an offering to Mars. Punishments range from the mildly humiliating to the full-blown Shakespearean tragedy. Late to formation, that's lashes. Lose your helmet, extra guard duty, caught sleeping during watch, that's death. They don't care if you had a fever, lice in your eyeballs, and a dead friend in your tent. Rules are rules. And then there's decimation. If your unit is caught retreating or rebelling, 1 in every 10 men is chosen at random and clubbed to death by the other 9. That's right, punishment by math. You survive the draw, then you beat your friend to death while a centurion watches. It's less of a correction and more of a bonding exercise. From hell, flogging is common with whips, rods, chains, whatever's handy, and they'll do it in front of the entire cohort for maximum effect. You're bleeding, sobbing, and probably learning nothing, because by the third flogging, it all starts to blur together anyway. Sometimes punishment isn't physical, it's logistical. Cleaning the latrines with your bare hands, guarding the baggage train in freezing rain, being assigned mule wrangling duty for a week. Nothing says reflect on your mistakes like digging a ditch with a spoon. Centurions are the enforcers. They're not your friends. They're battle-hardened, jaded men with loud voices and faster fists. They don't care about your sob story, they care about order. If they have to yell less tomorrow, that's a win. So you keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your armor polished, not because you respect authority, but because you've seen what happens when you don't. People think war is constant action. It's not. War is mostly waiting. As a Roman soldier, you'll spend 90% of your time doing absolutely nothing in the worst conditions imaginable. Think boredom, but with lice, screaming, and the occasional tribal raid. You sit around in camp, sharpening your sword for the 1,000th time, cleaning armor that will be filthy again by nightfall, and counting the boils on your own body. There's no entertainment, no music, no books, no board games, just the sound of someone farting next to the fire and a centurion grumbling about discipline. Conversations are repetitive and usually about food, death, or that one guy who used to be here but isn't anymore. Nobody asks philosophical questions, nobody ponders the stars, everyone just waits for the next order, the next march, or the next poor soul to get caught stealing onions. Letters from home take months if they arrive at all. You might get a clay tablet from your cousin saying, your goat died and your sister married a blacksmith. Riveting stuff. Most of the time you get nothing. Silence, which somehow feels worse. To break the monotony, soldiers gamble, dice made of bone, bets paid in moldy bread or questionable favors, fights break out, teeth get knocked out, the dice keep rolling. It's entertainment Roman style, tense, dirty, and likely to result in injury. If you're posted in some remote outpost, you might spend entire winters snowed in with a dozen men who snore, fart, and chew loudly. There are no women, no news, no relief, just your thoughts. And if you're thinking, you're suffering. So yes, the battles are terrifying, but it's the boredom that eats you from the inside. Slowly, patiently, like a centurion with nothing better to do than make your life marginally worse every hour. Let's talk salary. You signed up expecting riches, or at least enough money to not die poor. But Rome laughs in sesterces. You earn a modest wage, which is Roman for you can almost afford a sandal that doesn't have a hole in it. A legionary's base pay is around 900 sesterces a year. Sounds like a lot? It's not, especially when you remember that you have to pay for your gear, your food, and sometimes your own funeral. Yes, if you die on campaign, they might charge your estate for the firewood. And your commander can dock your pay for basically anything. Dropped your sword? That's a deduction. Lost a tent peg? That's a fine. Looked at him funny? Well, now you're buying the entire unit's vinegar rations this week. Bonuses exist. Technically, you might get a share of the loot after a successful campaign, assuming your general isn't skimming off the top, which he is, always. So, you might end up with a rusty brooch and half a sausage. Congratulations, you're rich. If you make it to retirement, you're promised a pension, land, maybe a plot somewhere out in Gaul, where the soil hates you and the locals hate you more, but most don't live that long. The pension is less of a reward and more of a myth to keep you marching. What do you actually buy? Bread, a new tunic every decade, maybe a trinket for a lover you barely see. Most soldiers pool money for communal stuff or drink it all the first night in town. Nothing like getting paid just to hand it over to the nearest wine cellar and pass out in a ditch. So yes, you're technically a professional, but in terms of income, you're one goat theft away from bankruptcy. Just another cog in Rome's underfunded killing machine. Ah, romance. That tender, life-affirming human experience that everyone craves, except you. You're a Roman soldier. You don't get love, you get regulations. Officially, legionaries weren't allowed to marry during service. That's right. 25 years of celibate-ish marching. Of course, not married doesn't mean not entangled in awkward relationships with disastrous consequences. You can have unofficial partners, camp followers, locals, that tavern keeper's daughter who definitely has other clients. Some soldiers start secret families anyway, hiding wives and children in the towns they're stationed near. You know, like a low-budget soap opera where everyone smells like goats and regret. It's all fine until your unit gets redeployed across the continent and suddenly you're explaining your absence in Gaul to a very confused toddler in Britannia. There are brothels, of course. Rome practically invented them. Some are state-run, others are private dives where diseases are included in the entry fee. Prices vary. Cleanliness does not. You're more likely to leave with a rash than a romantic memory. And if you fall for a local, that's cute. Until your commanding officer decides the town is rebellious and razes it to the ground. Nothing screams heartbreak like watching your girlfriend's house burn while your tent mate steals her goat. Women who follow the army as unofficial companions, laundresses, cooks, lovers, endure the same marches, the same danger, and none of the official recognition. They sleep in ditches, carry babies on the march, and get the joy of birthing future soldiers who will also probably die unnamed in some swampy ambush. So yes, you can technically love someone, but if you do, keep it quiet, keep it quick, and keep your expectations somewhere below happy ending. You're not writing poetry, you're just trying not to die alone. Every so often, when you're not too busy stabbing things or shivering in a flooded tent, you get a moment to write a letter home. This, in theory, is heartwarming. In practice, it's a masterclass in disappointment. Writing materials aren't just lying around. You need ink, a stylus, papyrus or wax tablets, and a basic understanding of Latin, which many soldiers don't have. If you're illiterate, you dictate your thoughts to that one guy who read a scroll once and now acts like he's Cicero. Then you entrust your letter to a messenger, a soldier on leave, a merchant, a wandering poet, someone, anyone, who might make it across mountains, rivers, and political unrest without getting stabbed or distracted. Postal service, please. This is the Roman army, not Hogwarts, and then you wait for months, maybe years, maybe forever. Sometimes your letters never arrive. Sometimes they arrive with helpful additions like wine stains or someone else's blood. When a letter does reach you, it's either a joyous scrap of emotional gold or a devastating update that your dog died, your house collapsed, and your younger brother just took your inheritance because you're legally presumed dead. Most letters are vague. I am alive. The food is terrible. I miss bread that isn't grey. Please send socks. Occasionally you try to be poetic, but war kind of robs you of lyrical flourish. Today I stabbed a Gaul. He screamed in a beautiful way. Love to mother. So yes, correspondence exists, but it's slow, unreliable, and mostly tragic. You write not to stay connected, but to remind yourself that somewhere, someone might still care that you exist. Probably. You might think that if you endure enough, the marching, the stabbing, the trench foot, someone will notice, maybe give you a promotion, a shiny new title, a slightly less lice-ridden blanket. But Roman military advancement is less about merit and more about politics, survival, and occasionally bribing the right centurion with fermented fish sauce. Let's start with promotions. Rise through the ranks, they say. Become a decanus, a centurion, maybe even a primus pilus, the senior centurion who has the honor of yelling the loudest and dying the slowest. But to get there, you need more than competence. You need connections, charisma, and a suspicious willingness to rat out your tent mates for falling asleep on watch. And if you do get promoted, congratulations, you now have more responsibilities, more paperwork, and a brighter target painted on your chest. You're the first one into battle and the last one to eat. Plus, you get to enforce discipline, which means overseeing punishments, which in Rome are medieval horror shows, even by ancient standards. For minor screw-ups, losing a piece of gear, falling asleep during sentry duty, looking slightly sassy, you might get flogged. Not a gentle warning. Actual flogging with sticks, whips, or the flat of a sword. It's not done in private either. Public pain builds morale, apparently. Nothing says cohesion like watching your comrade weep into the dust. Step it up to a bigger infraction and you get demoted, have your pay docked, or get put on latrine duty for a month, which is like community service in a sewer full of people's regrets and last night's stew. There's no union, no appeals process, just a centurion who doesn't blink when sentencing you to 40 lashes for losing a javelin. Then there's the nuclear option, decimation. If your unit flees in battle or disobeys orders as a group, the punishment isn't just harsh, it's mathematically horrifying. The entire unit lines up and 1 in every 10 soldiers is chosen at random to be beaten to death by the other 9. That's right. Rome invented team-building exercises that involve actual murder. You're not immune to group punishments either. One guy screws up, everyone suffers. A late return to camp might mean reduced rations for the whole tent. Somebody insults a superior, everyone marches double the distance tomorrow. Collective misery as motivational strategy. So yes, you can climb the ladder, but the ladder is slippery, on fire, and occasionally bites you. And even if you make it to the top, all it takes is one bad decision, one disgruntled superior, or one poorly interpreted goat spleen to send you crashing back down. Being a Roman soldier isn't just physically dangerous, it's administratively hazardous. You're constantly navigating rules, hierarchies, and expectations written by men in marble halls who think stabbing a barbarian is the same as balancing a budget. And through it all, your greatest accomplishment may be simply surviving the paperwork. Welcome to the bureaucracy of bloodshed. So, you've survived another brutal march, dodged punishment, and maybe only bled a little bit today. Time to relax, right? Time to unwind with a bit of Roman entertainment. Oh, you sweet, naive pile of broken cartilage. This is ancient Rome. Leisure activities here are designed to either break your spirit or your skull, whichever comes first. Let's begin with gambling. It's wildly popular among the legions. Dice games, board games, betting on foot races between diseased rats, anything to feel something other than chronic fatigue. But gambling is also a fast track to debt, and Roman debt doesn't come with a credit counselor. If you owe the wrong guy, you might find yourself short a few teeth or with property of Claudius carved into your shield. If you're near a city or a large settlement, you might hit the amphitheatre. The games, gladiators, beast hunts, executions, fun for the whole sadistic family. You watch convicts get torn apart by lions, criminals reenact historical defeats while dying, and sometimes they even light people on fire for added ambience. Popcorn not included, but fear not, there's always someone selling warm chickpeas soaked in vinegar. Then there's drinking. Romans drank wine like it was oxygen. Unfortunately, the stuff you can afford is basically vinegar with a grudge. It's watered down, laced with herbs, or stored in goatskins that make every sip taste like regret. But you drink anyway, because sometimes it's that or remembering your entire life is held together with leather straps and despair. Some soldiers write letters, or at least try to. Literacy isn't widespread, but if you're one of the lucky ones who can scribble on wax tablets, you might draft a heartfelt message home. You ask your mother how the farm is, tell your brother not to marry that awful neighbor girl, and try very hard not to mention the part where you saw your friend's leg explode in a Gallic ambush. Brothels? They exist, and the less said about them the better. Let's just say if you thought your lice problem was bad before, it's about to enter a whole new taxonomic classification. Plus, if you can't pay, the madam might report you to your superior. Good luck explaining that to the centurion with the missing eyebrow and zero tolerance for shenanigans. Sometimes there's music, a flute, a drum, a badly tuned lyre that's been through 5 campaigns and 1 accidental fire. It's not good, but it's something. Soldiers might sing songs about home, about war, about how much they hate their commanding officer but also love his moustache. Humor helps, so does mocking each other's horrible feat. There are also local festivals. If you're stationed in some dusty province, you might catch a barbarian ritual, a goat sacrifice, or a confusing celebration involving painted sticks and nudity. You're not supposed to join in, but who's going to stop you if everyone's drunk and someone just crowned you king of the mud pit? Ultimately, leisure time in the Roman army is less about joy and more about survival. You entertain yourself not to be happy, but to not notice how unhappy you are. Anything to distract from the aches, the filth, the looming battle, and the fact that you still haven't pooped normally in a month. So you laugh, you drink, you gamble, you sing off key into the night air, surrounded by other miserable men doing the exact same thing. Because in a world designed to crush you, sometimes the only rebellion left is a dirty joke and a swig of sour wine. Congratulations, you've survived training, marching, stabbing, dysentery, and at least one minor god's personal grudge. Now it's time to rest, or what the Romans generously called rest. Welcome to the Contubernium, your official living quarters. The word roughly translates to a tent full of men who all snore and smell like regret. Each Contubernium is home to 8 soldiers. Just 8, which might sound cozy until you remember that none of you have bathed properly in weeks. You all have trench foot, and 2 of you definitely have lice colonies that could apply for citizenship. Privacy? That's a modern sin here. You are always within smell range of another man's feet. In a temporary camp, it's a literal tent, coarse canvas, stretched over wooden stakes, pitched on rocky ground, and shared with the same energy as a clown car. You sleep shoulder to shoulder, armor stacked by your heads, weapons close by in case a wild boar or an ambitious barbarian crashes the slumber party. It's basically a sardine can with trust issues. In permanent forts, you're upgraded to stone or timber barracks. Don't get excited. These buildings are long, narrow, poorly insulated sheds divided into tiny rooms, 1 per tent group. The layout resembles an ancient prison, minus the charm. You get a straw mattress if you're lucky, a pile of hay if not, and always a fresh crop of fleas. The floors are dirt or stone, often damp, sometimes frozen. There's no fireplace in your little room, so you huddle for warmth or just slowly go numb. Outside that, there's a central fire pit in the hallway for cooking and warmth, which also means choking smoke, and the risk of someone setting your tunic on fire while trying to roast a rat. Above your room, a shared storage loft supposedly for your equipment, but it often becomes a mouse playground and the home of that one guy's illegal stash of fermented turnip juice. You know the one. He's also the guy who never stops talking about how he almost became a centurion before the donkey incident. At night, you sleep in shifts if you're near enemy territory. There's always the chance someone forgets to latch the gate and you all wake up screaming, knee-deep in galls, or worse, wake up at all and realize you're still in the barracks. Smells don't leave the contubernium, they accumulate. The mixture of sweat, mildew, foot rot, and boiled barley is so powerful it could knock out a charging boar. But eventually, your brain gives up and you stop noticing, which is worse, honestly. Still, this is home for years, a tiny, overcrowded, disease-scented box where you eat, sleep, complain, and slowly go insane with 7 other men, one of whom is always whittling something ominous. So next time you complain about your tiny apartment, remember, at least it doesn't have scabies in the ceiling and a roommate who uses a helmet as a chamber pot. Mail call. That beautiful, fleeting moment when you remember that somewhere far beyond the mud, blood, and bug bites, there is a world with actual chairs and people who aren't trying to stab you. Letters from home. The only thing thinner than the papyrus they're written on is the hope they'll contain good news. Let's start with the logistics. You don't get mail delivered to your contubernium door like some toga-clad Amazon Prime. Letters are rare, and delivery depends on a tangled web of couriers, supply caravans, and the ever-reliable hope it doesn't get stolen or eaten by a goat en route. You might get your mother's message 6 months late, after she's already died of a head cold. And when you do finally get a letter, well, let's hope someone in your squad can read. Literacy isn't exactly common among the rank and file. Most soldiers hand their mail to the one guy who can squint at squiggly Latin and turn it into spoken disappointment. And that guy always reads just a little too loud. The letters themselves are usually bad news. Crops failed. Uncle Gaius died. Your wife ran off with a potter. Your youngest child now thinks the neighbor is their father. Or worse, nothing personal at all. Just a brief note reminding you to send money home because the taxes didn't stop when you marched off to get dysentery in Gaul. Sometimes you get packages, not fun packages, no cookies or hand-knitted socks here. Maybe a dried fig, maybe a belt, maybe a passive-aggressive reminder that your cousin didn't have to join the army and is doing very well in the wine business. And if you want to send a letter, first find parchment, then ink. Then convince someone to write for you without charging too much. then bribe a caravan guard or traveling merchant to carry it, then pray to Mercury, god of messages, luck, and things not being lost forever in the bottom of a saddlebag. The delay between sending and receiving is so long you can respond to your mother's letter telling you she's sick with a hopeful "get well soon," only for her to have already been buried under a fig tree for weeks by the time it arrives. Mail is also read by officers, yes, your business, your family drama, your weepy breakdown about how you miss goats that don't try to bite, all scanned for anything suspicious like treason or complaints or honest emotion. And yet, mail day still matters. Because for one brief moment you remember there's a world beyond the barracks. A world with trees that aren't trying to shade your battlefield. A world with people who might actually remember your name. Not your legion number, not your rank. You. Then it's back to the mud and back to your duties. But for one page, one shaky sentence, you had a glimpse of something resembling humanity. So you've survived basic training, blistered your way across continents, dodged arrows, built 100 camps, eaten things that would terrify a modern raccoon, and now you're wondering, how long do I have to keep doing this? Short answer, not long. Longer than a gladiator, shorter than a philosopher. Welcome to the Roman legion's lifespan, a countdown clock you didn't know was already halfway through. Let's get the numbers out of the way. If you were recruited at 17 or 18 and you somehow avoided disease, malnutrition, violent death, and general bad luck, your official service lasted 25 years. If you lived that long, a major if, you could retire with a land grant, a small pension, and enough joint pain to predict rainstorms for the rest of your days. But reality was less generous. The average Roman soldier often didn't make it past his mid-30s. Not because of constant battles, though that didn't help, but because everything else was just as lethal. Infection from a scratch, fever from bad water, exposure, food poisoning, that mystery bite on your leg that just kept getting worse, and always, dysentery, the great equalizer of ancient empires. Death didn't just lurk on the battlefield, it marched beside you, slept next to you in the tent, and occasionally wore the face of your coughing tentmate, who should have been quarantined but wasn't because germ theory won't exist for another 1,700 years. Officers fared slightly better, more wine, less manual labor. But even they weren't safe. One bad campaign, one ambitious rival, one poorly timed meteorological event, and they'd end up just as dead, albeit in fancier sandals. And should you die, your body might get a shallow grave outside the camp if there was time. Otherwise, welcome to the ditch. Maybe someone mumbles a prayer. Maybe not. Your name might get carved into a stone, or maybe just forgotten, another notch in the endless tally of Rome's anonymous dead. But if, and it's a mighty if, you lived to see retirement, you could settle on a tiny plot of land, somewhere cold and remote, and slowly disintegrate in peace. No healthcare, no family left, just your memories, your limp, and your haunted dreams of screaming Germanic men with axes. So yes, life in the legions came with pay, rations, and the thrill of being cheered by senators who've never touched a shovel. But in the end, the most reliable thing about a Roman soldier's life was how soon it ended. Now that we've covered how short your life might be, let's talk about the tools you'll use to try and extend it, or at least take someone down with you, because as a Roman soldier, you're not just expected to kill, you're expected to do it efficiently, repeatedly, and with whatever stabbing instrument the quartermaster hasn't lost that week. Your best friend in battle is the gladius. It's short, about 18 to 24 inches, and designed not for flashy sword fights, but for getting uncomfortably close to your enemy and jabbing them in the guts. It's not elegant, it's not noble, it's a glorified metal tongue depressor, only used for ending lives instead of checking tonsils. You don't swing it, you stab, preferably in the stomach where the armor is thin and the screams are louder. Then there's your pilum, the Roman javelin. It's long, thin, and just bendy enough to be annoying. You throw it once and that's it. It bends on impact, so the enemy can't throw it back. Clever, yes, but it also means you're constantly making new ones, sharpening old ones, or trying to retrieve your last one from someone's spleen. You usually get 2 per soldier, but one always disappears in the mud. Let's not forget the scutum, your massive rectangular shield. It's almost as tall as you are, made of layered wood, covered in leather and rimmed with metal. It's a portable door you carry everywhere to block arrows, push enemies, and occasionally nap behind. Great for defense, terrible for stairs. It weighs enough to herniate your soul and catches every drop of sweat your armor misses. If you're lucky, and we use that word loosely, you might be assigned a spatha, a longer cavalry sword, better for slashing and used in later periods, or a hasta, a thrusting spear used mostly by earlier legionaries. You'll notice a theme here. Every weapon is about stabbing, poking, or bludgeoning as quickly and repeatedly as possible. There's no dueling, no dancing with swords, just get in, gut them, and hope you don't lose a finger. But weapons weren't just for war. You carried a pugio, a small dagger, part tool, part backup plan. It was for everything from cutting rope to last-ditch murder when your main weapons failed, or when your tent mate started snoring again. Convenient and unsettling. Maintaining your weapons is part of the job. Rust, your fault. Dull blade, also your fault. Lose anything, congratulations, you're on punishment detail, and the latrines are extra full this week. There's no armory technician or convenient smith waiting to save you. You sharpen, clean, and polish your own gear after every march, or you answer to someone with a stick and no sense of humor. Despite the reputation, Roman weapons weren't magical. They were brutal, practical, and designed to be used by exhausted, half-fed men in the rain. Their effectiveness didn't come from the steel. It came from the grim determination behind it and the knowledge that if you didn't kill fast, you'd probably be joining the pile of twitching limbs underfoot. So next time you see a gladius in a museum, don't admire the craftsmanship. Think about the poor soul who had to wipe someone's intestines off of it before breakfast. So here you are, 25 years later, assuming you didn't get speared in Gaul, freeze to death in Germania, or choke on your own bile during yet another outbreak of camp fever. You made it. You've completed your service. Your skin is mostly scar tissue, your spine creaks like a siege engine, and your joints sound like someone stepping on dry pasta. But you're alive. Mostly. Rome, in its infinite generosity, gives you a parcel of land somewhere remote and mosquito-infested, the ancient equivalent of a retirement home with wolves. You might get a modest pension if the clerk doesn't lose your paperwork or your former commander doesn't decide you look suspiciously ungrateful. Either way, congrats. You've been honorably discharged into obscurity. And what do you have to show for it? A chest full of trauma, a bag of stolen trinkets, and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's seen too many latrines and not enough soap. Your body is broken. Your memories are mostly blood and yelling. And the closest thing to a thank you you'll get is a younger soldier calling you sir before asking if the bread used to be this stale. The poets don't write about you. The senators won't remember you. Statues weren't carved in your honor, unless you count the one of Mars you marched past every week while smelling like boiled mildew. You are the backbone of the Roman Empire, which is a poetic way of saying you were used like a spine and then discarded like a bone. But still, somehow, despite everything, the blood, the blisters, the bugs, you stood in the line. You held the shield, you fought and marched and bled for a world that barely saw you, and you did it while itchy, half-drunk, and underfed. That's not just dedication, that's legendary stupidity, which in the Roman military is kind of the same thing as bravery. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed, free of lice and enemy arrows, take a deep breath. Exhale with gratitude. You are not a Roman soldier. You're not waking up to the sound of a centurion screaming or the stench of fermented goat sweat. You're free. Sleep well, modern citizen, because somewhere in the dust of time, your ancient counterpart is still marching, still fighting, still wondering when the hell he's allowed to sit down. And spoiler, he's not. So, you survived your time as a Roman soldier. Congratulations, that was unpleasant. But now that you've scrubbed off the lice, burned your sandals, and stopped weeping softly into your barley ration, let's take a more detached look at the broader world that made all of that horror possible. Because Rome wasn't just a nightmare for its foot soldiers, it was also a bureaucratic, architectural, and logistical fever dream that somehow lasted over 1,000 years. And if you're still awake, we're going to gently march one sandal-clad step at a time through the weird, brilliant, and occasionally absurd reality of the Roman Empire. At its height, the Roman Empire covered around 5 million square kilometers, stretching from rainy Britain to sandy Mesopotamia. That's roughly the distance between miserable wet fog and miserable dry heat. At one point, 1 in every 5 people on Earth lived under Roman rule, and yet they managed all this without email, GPS, or even functioning paper. The official founding date of Rome is 753 BCE, a number that was, let's be honest, almost certainly made up later by Roman historians with a fondness for round numbers and heroic wolves. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 CE, while the eastern half, known as the Byzantine Empire, kept bumbling along until 1453. That's over 2,200 years of Roman-adjacent activity, depending on how generous your definition of Rome is. The city of Rome itself began as a collection of huts on the Palatine Hill, probably built by suspiciously muscular shepherds. Through some combination of military innovation, shameless propaganda, and occasionally marrying the right Etruscan, Rome expanded from village to kingdom, then to republic, then to empire. Somewhere along the way they invented roads, sewage systems, and imperial arrogance. Unlike most ancient powers, Rome didn't just conquer, it assimilated. Conquered peoples were often absorbed into the system, granted citizenship eventually, and made to feel like reluctant partners in the world's largest hostile merger. Local gods were rebranded, local elites were bribed, and everyone got a statue of Jupiter whether they wanted one or not. Rome's success wasn't just brute force, it was infrastructure and law. The empire had a relatively standardized legal system, postal routes, official languages, coinage, and taxation. A provincial merchant in Gaul could, in theory, settle a debt with a senator in Cappadocia without being stabbed or overcharged more than once. This made Rome feel, to many, less like an occupying force and more like an unavoidable upgrade to your village's operating system. Of course, this all required a phenomenal amount of bureaucracy. Rome had layers upon layers of officials, from quaestors to procurators, each with a title more confusing than the last. They maintained tax rolls, public records, and census data on wax tablets and stone inscriptions, which made data entry slow but extremely permanent. Mistakes weren't deleted, they were chiseled out. The size of the empire also meant it was constantly under pressure. You can't control 3 continents with carrier pigeons and hope for the best. Rome spent an enormous amount of time and money defending its borders, especially the ones along the Rhine, Danube, and eastern deserts. It built Hadrian's Wall in Britain, not to keep out an invading army, but to discourage the Scots from raiding too enthusiastically while shouting in languages no one wanted to translate. And yet, despite the expense, the infighting, the periodic plagues, and the fact that many emperors were about 1 wine cup away from a full breakdown, Rome endured. It fractured, reformed, relocated, and rebranded. Emperors fell, capitals moved, gods changed names. But the idea of Rome, eternal, orderly, and vaguely threatening, refused to die. What made the empire's longevity even more astonishing was its cultural gravity. Even after Rome fell, kings and emperors across Europe called themselves Caesars, or Kaisers and Tsars if you squint. The Roman Catholic Church adopted Roman administrative structures. Even the US Senate can trace its name back to Roman times, though thankfully without the frequent assassination attempts. For now, Rome was less a country than a self-replicating idea, a blueprint for power, hierarchy, and how to efficiently steal grain from Egypt without starting a war. It wasn't always pretty, but it worked, and because it worked, it stuck. Long after the last legion packed up and the last aqueduct cracked, people still looked at the ruins and thought, well, that must have been something. In short, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it didn't collapse in one either. It limped, groaned, stabbed itself a few times, declared victory, and eventually faded into memory, leaving behind ruins, roads, and more Latin phrases than anyone really asked for. Rome's greatest strength wasn't just its armies, it was logistics. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads, with about 50,000 miles paved in stone. Some of them are still used today, which is both impressive and vaguely insulting to modern, pothole-ridden city planners. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just poetic, it was a logistical reality. Roman roads were built by military engineers and designed for speed, drainage, and durability. They included rest stops, mile markers, and sometimes horrifying taverns with questionable olives. If you were lost in the empire, a quick look at the nearest milestone could tell you how far you were from being overtaxed in the capital. The roads were made in layers: gravel, sand, stones, and more stones, because the Romans believed in doing it once and doing it right, or at least right enough to march an army over without everyone twisting their ankles. They even crowned the roads slightly so rainwater would run off, which is more consideration than most 21st century city intersections get. But roads weren't just for legions, they were for commerce, for messengers, and occasionally for disgruntled philosophers storming out of Senate debates. A trader could get from Gaul to Judea with relative ease, assuming they survived the bandits, weather, and the occasional collapsed bridge. And then there were the aqueducts, those elegant stone arches that make modern plumbing look like plastic toys. Powered entirely by gravity and an unreasonable amount of engineering genius, aqueducts could carry water from mountain springs into cities miles away without a single pump. Just a perfect slope and intense smugness. The Aqua Marcia, one of the longest, stretched more than 90 kilometers and delivered water with the steady reliability of a Roman tax collector. Multiple aqueducts often served the same city, just in case one was damaged or someone rich decided they needed a more exclusive water source for their villa's personal fish pond. This water was stored in massive cisterns, distributed through pipes made of lead, because lead poisoning hadn't yet made it onto the Senate floor as a concern, and supplied everything from bathhouses to fountains. Even the public toilets, which were long open benches with holes and no dividers, were connected to flowing water, proving that Rome believed in plumbing before it believed in privacy. And lest we forget, there were also sewers, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima, which is Latin for Great Sewer, though it may as well have meant gateway to Hades. Built originally in the 6th century BCE and still in partial use today, it was one of the earliest examples of urban wastewater management. Rome flushed out waste into the Tiber with more consistency than some modern cities can manage with email. The basilicas, forums, granaries, and warehouses weren't just functional, they were built to last. Massive stone structures, often reinforced with concrete, lined the empire. And Roman concrete, by the way, was a marvel of chemical durability. It could harden underwater, resist erosion, and casually put modern equivalents to shame. In short, Rome didn't just conquer the world. They paved it, plumbed it, and designed it to military spec. Their infrastructure wasn't decoration, it was a system, an empire of stone and math. And it's part of why the empire held together as long as it did. When the legions faltered, the roads still ran, the water still flowed, and somewhere a bored Roman still sat on a toilet, gossiping over a bucket of olives. The Roman Republic was famous for its complex political system. It had 2 consuls, a senate, popular assemblies, and a firm belief that power should be shared until someone got stabbed. Julius Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, kicking off a civil war that ended the Republic. He was declared dictator for life, which lasted until March 15th, 44 BCE, when a group of senators wielding tiny knives and enormous egos ended both his reign and his respiratory function. Then came the empire. Augustus, Caesar's adopted heir, became the first emperor. He cleverly kept all the old titles, princeps, imperator, pontifex maximus, and pretended not to be a monarch, despite clearly being one. This tradition of "I'm not an emperor, I'm just very powerful," continued for centuries. The Senate remained intact technically, it just became less of a governing body and more of a very well-dressed rubber stamp. Senators still debated, but now it was more about who could flatter the emperor with the most flowery Latin than about actual policy. Dissent, while not technically illegal, tended to result in sudden exile, mysterious suicides, or being fed to something with sharp teeth. And, oh, the emperors. Some were competent, like Trajan, who expanded the empire to its greatest extent, or Hadrian, who sensibly decided to build a big wall and stop expanding into angry, wet Scotland. But others, well, let's just say the job came, with a high turnover rate and an open-door policy for madness. Caligula appointed his horse to the Senate. Nero played the lyre while Rome burned, allegedly. And Commodus liked to fight gladiators who had to let him win. Power was hereditary when convenient and violently acquired when not. The so-called Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE featured, spoiler alert, 4 emperors in 1 year, thanks to civil war, assassinations, and good old-fashioned chaos. It was Rome's version of speed dating, but with more swords. The bureaucracy, however, remained impressive. Rome had provincial governors, tax collectors, legates, magistrates, censors, and other functionaries tasked with making sure the empire didn't collapse under its own weight. The grain supply was regulated, public works were managed, and people were occasionally executed for embezzlement. Civilization. Yet for all its flaws, Rome's system inspired modern governments. The US Senate gets its name from the Roman one. The concepts of checks and balances, terms of office, and codified law, all Roman exports. Unfortunately, so is the part where everyone eventually gets tired of compromise and someone tries to take over. In short, Roman government was a sophisticated, highly structured system built on law, tradition, and shared power. Until someone decided it was their turn to be worshipped as a living god. Then the knives came out, the statues went up, and the Senate quietly pretended it had always supported the winner. If Roman government was a machine, the emperors were the erratic drivers, and the bureaucracy was the overworked, underappreciated team trying to keep the wheels from falling off. And they nearly managed it for centuries. Rome's legal system was one of its crowning achievements. The 12 Tables, drafted around 450 BCE, were the foundation of Roman law and read like a combination of HOA bylaws and vague threats. Citizens were expected to memorize them, which made dinner parties sound like law, school cramming sessions. Over time, Rome's legal tradition evolved into a complex body of civil law that governed everything from land disputes to inheritance to exactly how many goats constituted a nuisance. Roman law was built on precedent and detailed legal argumentation. Jurists, basically ancient lawyers with worse robes, wrote massive legal commentaries that were so dense they could double as building materials. The Emperor Justinian, in the 6th century CE, famously compiled centuries of legislation into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a kind of ultimate Roman law box set that would later inspire legal systems across Europe. If you've ever sat through a modern law class and wondered why it feels ancient, well, it kind of is. The Roman bureaucracy, meanwhile, was a marvel of paperwork and passive aggression. Every province had a governor, typically a senatorial appointee, whose job was to collect taxes, maintain order, and occasionally not start a rebellion. Governors were supported by legates, quaestors, scribes, and accountants, all of whom had a keen eye for missing coins and a tendency to end up mysteriously rich at the end of their term. Corruption wasn't just common, it was expected. Rome didn't eliminate graft, it organized it. Then there were the censors, officials whose job was to maintain the census and public morals, essentially bureaucrats with clipboards and strong opinions about your lifestyle. They could strip you of your citizenship if they found you wanting. Wanting what? Hard to say. Decorum, probably, or fewer unpaid taxes. Despite the messiness, the sheer size and complexity of the empire required this system to function. Grain had to reach Rome, roads had to be maintained, troops needed to be fed, and letters had to get from Gaul to Syria faster than a camel with back problems. For all its flaws, the system worked better than you'd expect from a government run on wax tablets and shouting. And above it all sat the emperors. Some treated ruling like a divine calling. Others treated it like a particularly violent game of The Sims. Emperors could issue edicta, executive orders with the force of law, and their whims often determined the course of the empire. One emperor might favor tolerance and reforms. The next might declare war on a neighboring tribe because their envoy wore the wrong sandals. In ancient Rome, citizenship wasn't just a label, it was a lifestyle, a legal force field, a bureaucratic badge of honor. It meant you could vote, sometimes, sue people, occasionally, and perhaps most importantly, not be crucified. Rome was very particular about its tortures. Citizens got decapitated, everyone else got the full horror movie treatment. But this prize status wasn't distributed evenly. You could be born into it, earn it through military service, buy it if you were wealthy enough, or have it graciously bestowed upon you by a magnanimous emperor who may or may not be trying to curry favor with your province. Roman citizenship came with rights, but also with responsibilities, namely paying taxes and occasionally dying in a foreign swamp for imperial glory. The Roman social pyramid was aggressively tiered. At the top were the patricians, the ancient noble families who claimed descent from Rome's founding aristocrats and spent most of their time squabbling in the Senate, attending dinner parties, and finding new ways to appear important while doing very little. Their wealth wasn't just in land, it was in tradition, status, and the ability to wear especially white togas without irony. Below them were the plebeians, the common citizens. This wasn't an insult yet. Plebs made up the bulk of the Roman population. They were farmers, merchants, soldiers, artisans, basically everyone holding the empire together, while the patricians took credit. Plebeians could vote and own property, but their influence in politics was always filtered through layers of senatorial snobbery. Then came the freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted, usually by their owners. Freedmen could become quite wealthy and successful, especially in trade, banking, or administration. However, they still carried a social stigma, like a poorly hidden tattoo. They couldn't hold certain public offices, and their children had to climb the social ladder with extra polish and groveling. At the bottom, of course, were the slaves. Not a class exactly, but a population category so large it greased the gears of the entire Roman machine. Slaves in Rome could be farm workers, gladiators, cooks, scribes, secretaries, or even tutors for elite children. Imagine teaching Latin grammar to a senator's son while being legally classified as furniture. Slavery wasn't based on race, but on conquest and commerce. If Rome defeated your city, congratulations, you are now property. Despite the harsh conditions, slavery had one odd loophole. Manumission was relatively common. Some slaves could buy their freedom, be freed for loyalty, or be released in wills, and once freed, they could build wealth, establish families, and even hold a respected, if clearly marked, place in society. Then came the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE. Emperor Caracalla, in a moment of what some historians call fiscal inspiration, granted Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire. It was pitched as a grand gesture of unity and equality. In reality, it massively increased the number of taxable individuals, a heartwarming tale of imperial generosity, with a line item at the bottom. Of course, not all citizens were created equal. There were still distinctions, like optimo jure, with full rights, versus those who couldn't vote or hold office. And provincial citizens, especially in remote parts of the empire, often enjoyed their rights in theory only. The guy in Gaul who just became a Roman citizen probably didn't notice much change, except the new tax collector knocking on his door. Ultimately, Roman citizenship was a symbol of identity, a legal shield, and a state-sanctioned club with complicated rules and frequent subscription increases. It was the dream of many, the tool of the few, and the reason everyone kept asking, "Are you really Roman?" Let's not sugarcoat this. The Roman Empire thrived on human exploitation. Slavery wasn't just a side effect of conquest, it was a fundamental engine of the Roman economy. At its peak, it's estimated that about 20% of the population, possibly more in Italy, was enslaved. That's 1 in 5 people whose basic human rights were replaced with a price tag. Slaves came from everywhere: Gauls, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Germans, Britons. The spoils of war often came not just in gold or land, but in living, breathing labor. A Roman general didn't just win battles, he brought home thousands of enslaved people. Sometimes entire towns were depopulated and carted off to fuel the imperial workforce. If you lived anywhere Rome marched, there was a non-zero chance you'd end up in chains by sundown. Slavery in Rome was depressingly flexible. Enslaved people filled nearly every imaginable role. They worked in fields and mines, especially the silver and salt mines, which were basically slow-motion death sentences. They staffed wealthy homes, cleaned public baths, carried water, and served food at banquets they could never attend. They taught aristocratic children, wrote letters, managed businesses, and even served as financial advisors. A Roman senator might trust a slave with his entire estate, but wouldn't let him sit at the dinner table. The conditions varied wildly. Skilled slaves, Greek tutors, doctors, scribes could live relatively comfortable lives, sometimes even receiving wages or bonuses. Others were chained together in damp underground quarters, flogged daily or branded to prevent escape. Roman law technically allowed slaves to file complaints against cruel masters, but let's be honest, good luck finding a sympathetic judge when your legal status is closer to a chair than a citizen. Masters held the power of life and death. Literally, killing your slave might result in a fine if you did it in a particularly public or wasteful way, but generally it was viewed as a personal matter. The pater familias, or male head of the household, wielded absolute control, including the right to execute members of his household, enslaved or not without trial. Mercy, like most things in Rome, depended on mood and social status. There were paths to freedom, though they were steep and slippery. A slave could be manumitted, granted freedom by their master, especially after years of loyal service. Some could purchase their freedom with tips or savings. A freed slave became a libertus, a freed man, and while they could live as Roman citizens, vote in some cases, and accumulate wealth, they were never quite accepted as equals. The social scar lingered. Their children, however, could sometimes escape the stigma and climb the ranks of Roman society. Rome's treatment of slavery was transactional at best, dehumanizing at worst. There was no abolition movement, no mass protest, no moral reckoning. Philosophers like Seneca occasionally mused about kindness to slaves, but not their liberation. After all, what would happen to the economy if every estate lost its free labor force? Better to just recommend benevolent management and get back to the wine. And don't think resistance was absent. Slaves rebelled, famously and violently. Spartacus, the gladiator turned rebel, led a massive uprising from 73 to 71 BCE that terrorized Italy and required entire legions to crush. His defeat was followed by the crucifixion of over 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, a roadside reminder of Rome's idea of crowd control. In the end, Roman slavery was a brutal institution maintained by fear, force, and convenience. It touched nearly every aspect of life, from agriculture to literature. Even the greatest Roman minds, Cicero, Pliny, even Augustus, never truly questioned it. Because in their world, slavery wasn't just accepted, it was expected. A deeply embedded system built on the backs of millions whose names history rarely bothers to remember. The Roman Colosseum. The grand arena of blood, sweat, and very confused lions. A place where 50,000 Romans could gather to cheer, jeer, and snack on olives while watching people kill each other for sport. Gladiators were the main attraction, living, bleeding proof that nothing entertains quite like violence in a large public venue. Despite the Hollywood gloss, being a gladiator was less Russell Crowe and more human stress test. The vast majority of gladiators weren't volunteers seeking glory. They were enslaved people, criminals, or prisoners of war, what we might call non-consensual athletes. Some did volunteer, usually driven by poverty, desperation, or a self-confidence that would soon be tested by a trident to the sternum. Training took place in ludi, gladiator schools that were part gym, part prison, and part death prep center. Trainees were drilled constantly, fed a high-carb diet, they were nicknamed barley men, and taught how to die in a way that entertained the crowd. Injuries were frequent, morale was low, and no, there wasn't a motivational poster in sight. Gladiators fought in various styles depending on their assigned role. A Mamillo wore a heavy helmet and wielded a short sword and shield. A Retiarius used a net and trident, fighting in what was basically a fishing-themed fever dream. Others fought with curved blades, whips, or dual daggers. The goal wasn't always death, but rather putting on a dramatic, crowd-pleasing show. Think pro wrestling, but with significantly higher funeral costs. Contrary to popular belief, most fights didn't end in death. Gladiators were expensive to train and house, and dead ones didn't bring in future ticket sales. That said, fatalities were still common, and career spans were often measured in matches, not years. One bad roll of the dice, and you were a red smear on the sand. The average lifespan of a gladiator was short, bloody, and rarely included retirement. The audience, meanwhile, loved it. Senators, merchants, slaves, everyone packed into the stands to watch the carnage. Gladiators were sometimes sex symbols, their likenesses painted on walls and their names whispered in bathhouses. Fans bet on them. Women sent love letters, children imitated them with sticks, which is all very touching until you realize most of those fan favorites died before their 25th birthday. And then there's the famous thumbs down myth. In reality, no one's entirely sure what gesture meant kill him. Ancient sources mention the police verso, a turned thumb, but whether it was up, down, sideways, or twirling like pizza dough remains debated. It might have been the crowd shouting or the sponsor nodding. Either way, if you were lying in the sand, bleeding, waiting for some rich guy's finger to seal your fate, it probably didn't feel poetic. Gladiators who survived long enough could earn their freedom. A wooden sword, the rudis, symbolized emancipation and was granted after years of service or a particularly heroic performance. A few legendary fighters achieved fame and fortune, most didn't. In the end, the gladiatorial games weren't just entertainment, they were a public ritual, a blend of theatre, punishment, and propaganda. A reminder of Rome's power, its love of spectacle, and its casual disregard for human life, especially if that life could be weaponized for applause. Roman cuisine was varied. That's the nicest way to say deeply unfair depending on your income level. If you were poor, you likely ate the same meal every day: bread, lentils, some gruel made from barley or millet, and maybe a sad fig or a wild onion to spice things up if you weren't already using it as medicine. Meat? Rare. Spices? Unlikely. Satisfaction? Not on the menu. If you were rich, however, your palate lived in a different universe entirely. Exotic meats, imported spices, and culinary experimentation that often felt like a dare, disguised as fine dining. Roast flamingo, naturally. Boiled ostrich, yes please. Dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, served on silver platters. And don't forget jellyfish, so udders, and something described ominously in texts as fish milk. The elite Roman kitchen was part science lab, part stomach challenge. The undisputed king of Roman flavor was garum, a fermented fish sauce that functioned like Roman ketchup, if ketchup had been left in the sun for 3 weeks and smelled like regret. Made by layering fish guts with salt and letting the mixture ferment, in ceramic vats for months, garum was filtered and bottled like fine wine. It was pungent, potent, and poured over everything from vegetables to dessert. That's not an exaggeration. People even drizzled it on fruit. No one was safe. Despite its aroma, which has been likened to a seafood crime scene, garum was wildly popular across all social classes. Rich households imported premium blends from Hispania or North Africa, while the poor settled for cheaper, more viscous versions known as alec, the fishy sediment left at the bottom of the barrel. It was a booming industry. Entire coastal towns existed just to manufacture the stuff, their shorelines filled with vats of bubbling fish goo, and workers who presumably lost their sense of smell by age 12. Mealtimes in wealthy homes were more than just eating, they were theatre. The cena, or dinner, began in the afternoon and often stretched for hours. Guests reclined on couches in triclinium dining rooms, leaning on their left elbows and using their right hands to grab food from low tables. Courses came in waves: appetizers, entrees, desserts, and strange little palate cleansers like boiled parrot tongue or sea urchin custard. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with spices or honey, but never drunk straight. That was considered barbaric. Vomiting was not just an unfortunate side effect, it was a strategy. Wealthy Romans sometimes excused themselves between courses to purge and make room for more food. This was usually done discreetly in side rooms or with the assistance of servants. The concept of moderation was clearly not invited to the dinner party. Guests would return from a polite upchuck and dive back into the meal like nothing had happened, perhaps while listening to a dramatic reading of Virgil. Dinner entertainment could include music, poetry, juggling, or philosophical debate, depending on the host's taste or ego. If the gathering really got out of hand, there might be public shaming, political scheming, or spontaneous wrestling. Dinner was a social statement and expression of wealth and culture, and occasionally an open mic night for amateur lyricists with more wine than talent. For the working class, meals were far more practical. Food was prepared quickly and with whatever ingredients were on hand. Many city dwellers didn't have full kitchens, so they bought hot food from thermopolia, ancient fast food stores that served soups, stews, and flatbreads. These places were the McDonald's of Rome, fast, cheap, and deeply suspect in terms of food safety. Desserts for the rich included honey cakes, dates stuffed with nuts, and pastries soaked in wine. The poor might enjoy dried fruit if they were lucky, or simply finish their meal with a crust of bread and a sip of vinegar water. The concept of dessert as a separate, sugary course wasn't fully developed, but the craving for a sweet ending is as old as empire. In short, Roman cuisine was an edible expression of class. The wealthy feasted with abandon, mixing flavors that bordered on offensive, while the poor filled their bellies with the bare minimum. But across all social lines, the one uniting ingredient was fermented fish sauce. It's nice to know that whether you dined in a marble villa or a roadside stall, you were always just one spoonful of garum away from a digestive incident. You've already met the Roman soldier. Blisters, lice, trench foot and all, but let's zoom out for a moment. The Roman army wasn't just a bunch of sweaty men stabbing things, it was the empire's iron skeleton. Without it, Rome would have collapsed under its own decadence before the first aqueduct was finished. The legions didn't just fight wars. They maintained peace, built infrastructure, collected taxes, crushed rebellions, and occasionally caused them. A typical legion consisted of about 5,000 to 6,000 men, broken down into cohorts, centuries, and headaches for modern historians. Despite the name, a century didn't actually contain 100 men. Usually it was 80. Why? Because Roman math liked to keep you guessing. Each century was led by a centurion, a grizzled veteran with a loud voice, a vine staff for discipline, and the patience of a man who's broken up too many spear fights before breakfast. These weren't just warrior mobs, they were mobile cities. When they moved, they brought blacksmiths, cooks, engineers, doctors of the bleeding and sawdust variety, clerks, priests, and hangers-on. Every soldier had gear, rations, and the unenviable task of setting up camp every night. And we're not talking about pitching a cozy tent under the stars. Roman camps were fortified, geometrically planned, and built with such precision that archaeologists still marvel at them today. Picture IKEA instructions, but with more yelling and trench digging. And yes, the bureaucracy. Every legion had scribes and administrators tracking supplies, personnel, promotions, casualties, and pay. Rome invented military red tape before red tape was even a thing. Paperwork inscribed on wax tablets was essential. Mr. Ration? There's a form. Want to complain about a superior officer? There's a form, but also good luck surviving the week. Lost your sword in battle? Oh, there's definitely a form and a fine. The army wasn't just about fighting. When not busy with conquests, soldiers doubled as construction crews. They built roads straight enough to shame modern highways, bridges that stood for centuries, and forts so well planned that entire towns eventually grew around them. They also drained marshes, dug canals, repaired aqueducts, and maintained border defenses. Roman soldiers were expected to be part warrior, part laborer, part bureaucrat, and part amateur geologist. Deployment wasn't a short-term affair. Soldiers often served for 20 to 25 years, stationed in distant provinces they'd only previously heard about in drunk stories from travelling merchants. A recruit from Gaul might spend 2 decades patrolling a dusty outpost in Syria. Soldiers married locally, often unofficially, since marriage was banned for active duty troops until the 3rd century CE, learned new languages, and developed regional identities. The army was as much a cultural sponge as it was a fighting force. And let's talk death. Soldiers faced more than just enemy swords. Disease, boredom, exposure, dysentery, scorpion bites, and food poisoning killed plenty of legionaries. Barracks were overcrowded and unsanitary. Medical care was experimental at best, and their best hope during surgery was fainting before the bone saw came out. If you didn't die in battle, your odds of simply rotting from within were pretty decent. Then there were the mutinies. Rome's army, for all its discipline, wasn't shy about threatening the emperor when payroll was late or retirement packages went missing. Several emperors met their end at the hands of their own troops. This means Roman soldiers were loyal until they weren't, which, given the working conditions, is shockingly fair. Still, retirement wasn't a myth. If you made it to the end of your service, you could expect a plot of land, a modest pension, and chronic knee problems from decades of forced marches. Some retired veterans settled in the provinces where they'd served, helping to Romanize the local population through a combination of farming, drinking, and recounting exaggerated war stories to anyone who would listen. In the end, the Roman army wasn't just an institution. It was an empire-wide system of control, infrastructure, intimidation, and integration. It spread Rome's influence far beyond the battlefield and ensured that whether by sword, road, or census, the empire kept marching forward, even if your feet didn't want to. People loved to debate why Rome fell. Was it the endless barbarian invasions, the runaway inflation, the moral rot and gladiator addiction? Was it poisoned wine, poisoned plumbing, or poisoned philosophy? Maybe Christianity, maybe too much Christianity, or perhaps it was simply the weight of trying to run half the known world with sandals and scrolls. The short answer is yes, all of it, over a very long, painful period. Rome didn't wake up one day and forget how to be an empire. Its fall was a slow, grinding process, more like an elderly titan collapsing into a heap of unpaid taxes and unreliable legions than a sudden, dramatic implosion. By the 3rd century CE, the cracks were already showing. Plagues had thinned the population. The military was stretched thin. The economy was wheezing. The silver content in Roman coins dropped like a bad stock market. If you were alive then, you'd be watching the slow-motion unraveling of a civilization that used to be invincible and was now just incredibly overextended. The 3rd century is often called the crisis of the 3rd century, which is just a polite way of saying total mess. In the span of 50 years, Rome saw over 20 emperors come and go, most of them violently. It became a revolving door of ambition, betrayal, and headless statues. Civil wars flared up like acne. Provinces tried to secede. Foreign invaders began testing the fences, and the bureaucracy, still chugging along, of course, recorded all of it with passive-aggressive precision. Barbarian tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns weren't just mindless hordes. They were opportunistic, adaptable, and increasingly militarized. Many had served in Roman armies as mercenaries. Some were even invited in as foederati, allied groups given land in exchange for defense, but that arrangement quickly soured when Rome stopped being able to feed or pay them. Unsurprisingly, swords were drawn. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked for the first time in nearly 800 years. Alaric and his Visigoths walked in and reminded everyone that even eternal cities can have very bad Tuesdays. Then, in 455 CE, the Vandals took their turn. They looted the city so thoroughly that their name became a synonym for casual destruction. By 476 CE, the Western Empire finally gave up the ghost. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. No dramatic final stand, no blazing glory, just a quiet transfer of power and a polite escort into historical obscurity. But here's the twist. Rome didn't die, not completely. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, kept going strong. It evolved into the Byzantine Empire, which was Roman in name, Orthodox in religion, and impressively Byzantine in its politics. The Byzantines carried on Roman traditions, law, and bureaucracy for nearly another 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire had its own issues, plagues, crusaders, scheming eunuchs, angry Persians, but it held on until 1453, when the Ottoman Empire finally pried Constantinople out of Roman hands. That's nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western half. For context, that's like if the Confederate States had continued on as a functioning government until the year 2800. So yes, Rome fell. But it also didn't. It morphed, it fractured, it simmered in different languages and robes under different flags. Its ghost haunted medieval Europe in the form of emperors, popes, and Renaissance artists who couldn't stop quoting Cicero. Even now, echoes of Rome linger in legal systems, architecture, calendars, and Latin phrases that no one really understands but still look nice on university buildings. In the end, Rome's fall wasn't a thunderclap, it was a long, sputtering candle. And like all great empires, it left behind ruins, legends, and a long list of people arguing about what exactly went wrong. Even in death, Rome casts a long shadow. Our laws, our languages, our architecture, and our terrible habit of naming things after emperors, looking at you, Caesar salad, all come from this ancient superstate. You can't swing a toga in a Western civilization class without hitting a Roman reference. The Romans gave us concrete domes, sewage systems, and months named after people with control issues. Latin, the language of the Romans, is the root of Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. It's also the language of medical diagnoses, scientific names, and high school regret. Latin is technically a dead language, but it refuses to stay in the grave. It still haunts courtrooms, church services, and your prescription labels. Architecturally, we're all still basically Roman fanboys. Courthouses, museums, and capitol buildings across the globe are decorated with columns, arches, and domes that owe more to ancient Rome than to any modern aesthetic sense. That grand marble look that screams serious government stuff? Rome did it first, and probably better. Roman law also lives on in surprising places, the concept of innocent until proven guilty. Roman civil law codes in much of Europe. Roman legal maxims like habeas corpus, pro bono, and in vino veritas, all straight from Latin. Even the word justice has Latin roots. The next time you show up for jury duty and daydream about stabbing someone with a gladius, just remember you have Rome to thank for both the legal system and the suppressed rage. Even your calendar is Roman. January comes from Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings. March is named after Mars, god of war. July and August were named after Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, respectively, because nothing says humility like hijacking time itself. And February, it was left short because apparently the math got tricky and some emperor just couldn't be bothered. Christianity, which started as a persecuted cult under Roman rule, eventually became the official religion of the empire and then the foundation of medieval Europe. The Roman Catholic Church still calls its headquarters the Holy See, still operates in Latin, and still dresses its officials like they stepped out of a very well-funded toga party. And then there's the road system. Many old Roman roads still exist in Europe, some even still in use. These ancient highways are buried under modern ones, quietly supporting busloads of tourists, wondering where the nearest gelato stand is. Every time you drive a straight road that somehow avoids a mountain or swamp, thank a Roman engineer with an unhealthy obsession for efficiency. But perhaps Rome's greatest legacy is conceptual. It invented the idea of empire as something more than conquest, a civilization built on infrastructure, assimilation, and bureaucracy. Every superpower since has borrowed Rome's playbook, whether consciously or not. When America was figuring out its own government, the Founding Fathers referenced the Roman Republic so often you'd think they were all writing fan fiction. So, no, Rome never really vanished. It just slipped quietly into history's bloodstream. It lives in language, law, religion, concrete, and every overly ambitious civilization that thinks it can outlast the forces of time and entropy. And if you're listening to this right now, letting your eyelids droop while pondering aqueducts and gladiators, then Rome has done what it always aimed to do. It left a mark. Not always glorious, not always clean, but unmistakably Roman. So, as you drift into sleep, remember the Roman Empire was a marvel of human achievement and human failure. It conquered the world with sandals, marble, and sheer audacity, and then collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. A fitting end to a civilization that could build aqueducts but never figure out how to keep a stable emperor for more than 5 minutes. Good night, citizen, or should I say, civis Romanus.